Jericho was a city so ancient and powerful that its inhabitants believed they were invincible, surrounded by gigantic walls, full of wealth, lust, and limitless pleasures. But at the same time, it was a place where idolatry, corruption, and immorality completely dominated the lives of the people. Inside the temples, sexual rituals were performed in the name of pagan gods. Men and women indulged in sin without fear of the consequences. They believed that nothing could destroy them until everything collapsed inexplicably. What was really going on inside the walls of Jericho? Why was this city that thrived in the middle of the desert completely destroyed? And does its history serve as a warning for today? Jericho is a mysterious city, so ancient that its origins date back to the dawn of humanity, a prosperous place surrounded by immense stone walls, full of wealth and known as one of the world's first great urban centers. But it was also a place steeped in idolatry, corruption, and immorality. That was Jericho. Now think with me, if you were there, living within those impenetrable walls, surrounded by luxury and excess, would you believe that any army could break them down? The truth is that the inhabitants of Jericho were so confident in their fortress that they never imagined what was to come. The Bible tells us in Joshua 6:1-2, "Now Jericho was shut up tightly because of the children of Israel. No one went out or came in. Then the Lord said to Joshua, 'Behold, I have given Jericho into your hand, and its king and its mighty men of valor.'" Sounds impossible, doesn't it? How could a fortified city with such high and thick walls simply fall? And more than that, what led God to decree its destruction? Jericho was not just an ordinary city, it was a symbol. Its way of life represented everything that alienated man from God. And here's something you need to understand. God is patient, but he doesn't ignore sin. What happened inside those walls went far beyond wealth and commerce. Idolatry had taken hold of the city. Its inhabitants worshipped false gods, sacrificed children, and practiced dark rituals. Corruption was at every level, and immorality was so common that no one could see the error of their ways. Before talking about the immorality of the women of Jericho, we need to understand how this decadence spread throughout the city. But what if I told you that before Rome, before the Egypt of the pharaohs, even before Babylon, there was already a prosperous and well-established city, a place where humanity began to stop being nomadic and build something lasting? That city was Jericho. The story of Jericho begins more than 10,000 years ago, in what historians call the Fertile Crescent, a region blessed by God, where the first human beings learned to plant, harvest, and for the first time settle in one place. While other tribes were still wandering in search of food, the inhabitants of Jericho discovered a way to tame the land. Jericho had something that no other region had, a spring of fresh water in the middle of the desert. And where there is water, there is life. This gift from nature made the city a refuge and a strategic point for traders, shepherds, and travelers crossing the Jordan Valley. The book of Deuteronomy 34:3 calls Jericho the city of palm trees, and for good reason. Thanks to its privileged location, the city prospered with plantations of dates, wheat, and barley. But that's not all that made Jericho stand out. The inhabitants of this ancient city were pioneers in the art of construction. Archaeological discoveries show that they erected stone walls at the dawn of humanity, something that no other civilization did at the time. They knew that the city needed protection, both from invaders and from the desert itself. Jericho was not only an agricultural center, but also a commercial hub. Its position allowed for the exchange of goods between different regions. Salt, spices, textiles, and precious metals passed through its gates, further enriching its inhabitants. But here's something curious. Whenever man prospers, he runs the risk of forgetting God. Human history proves this time and time again, and that's exactly what began to happen in Jericho. The city that began as a miracle of civilization began to move away from the Creator, and so what was once a center of blessings became a place of excess, idolatry, and corruption. But how did this happen? What turned Jericho from God's plan to become a symbol of decadence? Right after this, we will talk more about the immorality of the men and women of Jericho. But before that, we need to discuss the luxury within the walls. Jericho was not just an ancient city, it was a symbol of prosperity and ostentation. Those who passed through its gates encountered bustling streets, markets full of valuable goods, and luxurious houses decorated with tapestries and gold objects. Merchants came from all parts to sell spices, rare fabrics, and precious stones. But behind this shine was a dark side that few dared to question. The city was a center of wealth, and where there is wealth without the fear of God, there is also corruption. The rulers lived surrounded by luxury, exploiting the resources from trade and the population. Money flowed freely, but with it came excesses. Biblical and historical accounts point to Jericho as a place given over to idolatry. Different gods were worshipped, and temples were built for religious practices that involved questionable rituals, including human sacrifices and ceremonies of sacred prostitution. The true God had been forgotten, replaced by images and beliefs that promised fertility, abundant harvests, and pleasure without consequences. The inhabitants of Jericho saw no problem with their customs. For them, their impregnable walls ensured security, and their gods blessed them with abundance. But what they did not know was that true protection comes from God, and their false beliefs could not shield them from divine judgment. The story of Jericho is filled with lessons about human arrogance, idolatry, and the consequences of ignoring God's will. The city prospered for a long time, but its destruction was sudden and complete. What happened there serves as a warning. Over-reliance on wealth, the reckless pursuit of pleasure, and indifference to sin can lead to ruin, no matter how impregnable the walls around us may seem. The collapse of Jericho was not only a physical destruction, it was also a spiritual lesson. The city that believed itself invincible was destroyed because it ignored divine warnings and gave itself over to sin. This event, recorded in the Bible, holds far greater significance than just the history of an ancient city. It teaches us that no matter how strong and prosperous we may seem, there is always a risk in ignoring divine principles. Jericho trusted in its walls, but the Lord showed that no wall, no matter how high, could protect a city that had turned away from God. The fate of Jericho should serve as a warning to all of us. True safety and prosperity do not come from wealth or human strength, but from living according to divine principles. The story of Jericho is not just a reminder of an ancient event, but a timeless lesson that resonates even today. For 7 days the Israelites marched around the city, and on the 7th day, with the sound of trumpets and the cries of the people, the walls collapsed completely. But were there flaws in the structure of these walls? Some theories suggest that the walls of Jericho were built on an unstable foundation, which could have contributed to their sudden collapse. Other speculations point to the possibility of an earthquake in the region, a phenomenon that, coincidentally or not, could have been the means by which God fulfilled his plan. The truth is that regardless of the scientific explanation, the destruction of Jericho was an event that marked history and demonstrated that no human force can oppose the will of God. Now, imagine the reaction of the inhabitants of the city when they saw their walls crumbling before their eyes. What once seemed indestructible fell in a matter of minutes. Despair took over, and the fate of Jericho was sealed. But there is still something that needs to be revealed. Within the walls of this city, there was a society marked by moral corruption and extreme immorality. In the next chapter, you will discover how the sexual practices inside Jericho reflected the distance from God. What happened there is something few speak of, but it needs to be told. But if you believe that God is your true fortress, declare it now in the comments. Comment, "My security is in God," and show that your faith is not in fleeting things, but in the Almighty God. Jericho was not just a city surrounded by physical walls. Within these walls, there was another fortress, the culture of immorality that dominated daily life. For many, Jericho was a commercial center and a strategic point on the map of antiquity. But for those who knew its customs, the city was a reflection of the moral decay of the time. Among the many dark aspects of Jericho's society, one of the most striking was the role of women. After all, were they respected or simply used to satisfy desires and pagan rituals? Did women in Jericho have power, or were they submissive? Contrary to what many might imagine, some women in Jericho held status and influence, especially those connected to nobility and trade. However, for most common women, the reality was different. They were often treated as commodities, exchanged in arranged marriages, or used in religious rituals dedicated to pagan gods. Female beauty was exploited for political and religious purposes, and in many cases, women had no control over their own lives. But there was something even more shocking within the walls of Jericho: sacred prostitution. Prostitution in the temples, a ritual or a justified mistake. Ancient peoples believed that the fertility of the land was linked to human fertility. Therefore, in temples dedicated to pagan gods like Baal and Ashtoreth, there were rituals in which women were forced to have sexual relations with priests and foreigners in search of blessings. These practices were not seen as sin by the inhabitants of Jericho. On the contrary, they were considered a way of pleasing the gods to ensure good harvests, protection from enemies, and prosperity. But God saw all of this. In Leviticus 18:24-25, the Bible makes clear the judgment on these practices. "Do not defile yourselves with any of these things, for by all these the nations are defiled, which I am casting out before you, and the land is defiled. Therefore I visit the punishment of its iniquity upon it, and the land vomits out its inhabitants." Jericho believed its customs would bring prosperity, but in reality, they were digging their own destruction. Rahab, a woman marked by her past, but redeemed by her future. In the midst of this culture of immorality, there was a woman named Rahab. She was not noble, nor was she a priestess, nor did she hold a respected position. On the contrary, she was known as a prostitute. Rahab's house was strategically located on the city walls, where many travelers and merchants passed by. She likely heard many stories about the deeds of the God of Israel, and knew that something was about to happen. So when the spies sent by Joshua arrived in the city, she was the one who hid them and helped them escape. But why? Because Rahab, unlike the other inhabitants of Jericho, believed in the true God. She recognized that the city's walls could not protect them from divine judgment and asked for mercy. Her faith was rewarded, and her family was spared on the day of destruction. Rahab's story teaches us that even in the midst of corruption, prostitution, and idolatry, God still seeks those who choose to turn to Him. Jericho was more corrupt than other cities of the time. Perhaps you're wondering, was Jericho really so different from other ancient cities? The truth is that many ancient civilizations had immoral practices. Sodom and Gomorrah, for example, were destroyed for the same reason: perversion and the total rejection of God's principles. Babylon was also known for its lust and idolatry. However, Jericho carried symbolic weight. It was the first city that God's people faced when entering the Promised Land, and its destruction marked the beginning of a new era for Israel. God was showing that wherever His people set foot, wickedness could not remain. And now, I ask you, have you noticed how today's society resembles Jericho? The world preaches that everything is allowed, that there's no problem in straying from God's principles. But are we not rebuilding walls of sin that will one day collapse before the Lord? If you believe that God is still sovereign and that He transforms even those who live in immorality, comment now, "Jesus is my fortress." And in the next chapter, we'll delve into the most impressive part of this story, how the city that seemed impregnable was destroyed in an instant. What happened there was a warning for all future generations. The siege and the fall, the legend of the crumbling walls. Imagine the tension within the walls of Jericho. The inhabitants, confident in the protection of their fortified city, believed they were safe. But something different was happening outside. The Israelite army, led by Joshua, had surrounded the city, but instead of direct attacks or conventional attempts to bring down the walls, God gave a unique instruction: march around the walls once a day for 6 consecutive days. On the 7th day, the Israelites were to march around the city 7 times, blowing trumpets, and at the sound of the people's shout, the walls would fall. And so it was. On the 7th day, with the sound of the trumpets and the war cry of the Israelites, the walls of Jericho collapsed. According to the biblical account, the walls fell so completely that the Israelites were able to invade the city and conquer Jericho with ease. The event was a clear sign of God's power, who used unconventional means to show that his power and sovereignty were above human constructions. What seemed indestructible crumbled before God's will. The Lord showed the world that when he acts, nothing can resist his strength. The destruction of Jericho was not just a military defeat, but a divine judgment on a city that had given itself over to corruption, idolatry, and immorality. The siege of Jericho and its destruction mark an important chapter in the history of the people of Israel, showing how God acts on behalf of those who are faithful to him and how he punishes nations that stray from his principles. Jericho, with its walls and riches, represents human power that without God's presence is doomed to ruin. The walls fell not just due to a natural or structural phenomenon, but as a testimony to God's supernatural power, which can make the impossible happen to fulfill his purpose. This event continues to be remembered today as a symbol of how human power structures are powerless before divine will. If this content was useful to you, please support the channel by subscribing so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. Together, we can enlighten more minds and deepen our understanding. I thank you for your presence, and may God bless you.